Join us in the fight to restore liberty and American exceptionalism. Together, let's make the case that our charters of freedom are worth defending and honoring. Right here is where the great American experiment comes alive. Let's get to work.
Okay. Question number 3. You guys ready up there?
I'm ready.
Ready.
Okay. The affirmative argument here, the first speaker will be Mr. Krauser. The question is, should the general welfare clause be limited? Mr. Krauser, 4 minutes.
In fact, the general welfare clause was put in there to limit what it is that ultimately the federal government is permitted to do. Consider this. If you and I were to commit to one another that we were going to read 700 pages a week in the United States Code, and we committed to do that, every week, 700 pages, how long do you think it would take us to get through that? 25,000 years. 25,000 years. We live in a system of government that is simply too big. We have bureaucracies. In America today, at the federal level, we have 250 bureaucracies that in 2012 passed over 6,100 regulations onto the American people. The bigger government is, the less free people ultimately are. And I think we have to remember it was James Madison. James Madison was the one who made it emphatically clear in Federalist Paper number 45 that the powers of the federal government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, are few and defined. Take a look at the General Welfare Clause, what it is that it says. It's in Article 1, Section 8. And in Article 1, Section 8, you have 17 clauses. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, you have the taxation clause. And within the taxation clause, it outlines that the federal government is permitted to tax, and it outlines 3 specific purposes for that taxation: to pay the debts, to provide for the common defense, and for the general welfare. Well, what does the General Welfare Clause mean? Well, today we've got individuals at the federal level who believe that the General Welfare Clause means the power to do anything that the federal government wants to do, so long as it's in the interest of the general welfare. The fact of the matter is that is not consistent with history. It's not consistent with what the founders said. It's not consistent with the various state conventions that happened when they were considering whether or not to ratify the Constitution. It's not consistent with the statements that were made at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Here is what Thomas Jefferson said about the General Welfare Clause. Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated. Well, what does that mean? If the General Welfare Clause is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, there's 16 other clauses. That's what's being referred to. The ability to exercise those 16 other powers outlined in Article 1, Section 8 can only be exercised if it benefits the general welfare. In other words, if you're permitted to put together and construct post roads, that's one of the powers of Congress. Well, you can't just put together post roads up in the Northeast. It's got to be consistent throughout the country. Post offices, that's a power that the federal government has. You can't just put up post offices in the Southwest. It has to be consistent across the board. We don't want special interest groups coming and lobbying Congress. Oddly enough, that's precisely what's going on. The General Welfare Clause has almost nullified our Constitution. James Madison said this: if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions. That's what we've become. We've allowed the General Welfare Clause to be interpreted in such a way as to absolutely nullify the following 16 powers. The fact of the matter is, if this was the power, if the General Welfare Clause was giving the federal government the power to do anything that it wanted to, tell me why we have the following 16 enumerated powers. There would be no need for the Army-Navy Clause. There'd be no need for the Commerce Clause. There'd be no need for the Post Road Clause, because the General Welfare Clause would have given them power to do those things. The fact of the matter is that the text and history support this idea that, in fact, it was designed to restrict, not to amplify their power. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Weisser, 1 minute for us to stay there.
Mr. Krauser,
It's Krauser.
Krauser.
It's okay.
I don't want to disparage your history. I noticed that you mentioned Thomas Jefferson. I don't remember him being at the Constitutional Convention.
He wasn't.
And so his commentary on the Constitution itself is as a spectator, not as a participant.
The fact of the matter is that James Madison was the lead stenographer in the...
That wasn't what I was talking about.
Well, I'm going to answer your question. If you're going to ask me a question, I'm going to answer it. James Madison was the lead stenographer throughout the convention. His education came in large part through numerous books, volumes of books, cases of books that had been shipped to him from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had an incredible influence on what happened at that convention from May to September of 1787. There can be no denying that. To deny it rejects history.
To suggest, but the way that you put it into the sentence made it sound like he was there. So I'm wondering about the purpose of referring to him at that time. Talking about the actual process of writing.
The reason for referring to that, again, I referred to Thomas Jefferson because he had an incredible influence, but I also referred to James Madison. It might be nice for you to respond to James Madison's comment, which mirrors the comment made by Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps you could do that for us.
I'm not. But thanks. I appreciate y'all. I was actually going to respond to my negative arguments. I have 5 minutes on that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Proceed.
One of the first things I want to point out is when you talk about the government, you talk about it being very big and complicated. And that's okay. We have a country of 300 million people. We have a country that is the majority of a continent. It's a very big situation. Our inability to comprehend all the aspects of our government doesn't mean the government's wrong. We can't understand the universe. It doesn't mean the universe is wrong. The government employs something like, if you count all the military, et cetera, something like 11, 12 million people. That's a very complicated system. So just saying that we're going to worry about it because it's big, well, then we should worry about the ocean. I don't understand the idea of rejecting a government because it's big. But when it comes to the, we're talking about Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 1, which is the only place in the Constitution that really stands out for me where there's a repetition. In the preamble of the Constitution, it establishes what our basic values are, what the purpose of a government is. They want to form a more perfect union, improve over the Articles of Confederation that had the country at the brink of civil war and Shays' Rebellion where armies were shooting Revolutionary War heroes. Establish justice, make sure that there was some sort of balance for rich versus poor and a way that the government would deal with disputes. Ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare. And then that gets repeated in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 is the section of the powers of the government. There's, he mentioned 17 paragraphs, there's 18 actually. Article 1 is, first paragraph is the one that we're talking about here, and it says, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Now, that's one aspect of what we want our government to do. As Krauser pointed out, we also go on to establish the coining of money, development of post roads, regulations for the militia, the regulations for the Navy. There's a wide variety of things that the government is empowered to do in this section. But in my interpretation, they all come out of the intent of provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. Once again, we're not stuck in 1787. We don't have to all die of diphtheria. We don't have to have our milk spoil every night. We have had societies improve. We've had technological improvements, and we have a much more complex society, so our government can do more to promote the general welfare and provide for the common defense. When it comes to common defense, that's against enemies abroad and domestic, so that's, to my mind, where we end up with things like the EPA, where we end up with labor laws, provide for the common defense, protect the American people from those who would abuse them. So, the idea of a limit on the general welfare clause, well, if our country is really about all of its citizens, and I think it is, then how are we going to limit what we do to improve our general welfare? Why would we want to make a limit? The guy in the third row back there, do I want to limit him from having a good life? Do I want my government to prevent doing things that it could have done to improve his life? No, I don't want that. I want our government to care about us like we would our fellow brothers. Stop thinking of looking for some excuse to use the Constitution as a justification to stop caring about the rights and lives of others. The General Welfare Clause is the intent of our government. It's not just out there to be some distant, separated third entity that looks over you like a big brother. The government is 12 million people. It's meant to make your life better. That's why we have a government. That's why we have to have a government. Because I can't build roads. I can't build a navy. Those things improve my general welfare. Post offices improve my general welfare. I don't see why we would want to have a limit on improving the welfare of our country if the country really isn't of, by, and about people.
Thank you. Mr. Krauser?
Please tell us what specific power is given to the federal government through the General Welfare Clause. What power does that give them?
It doesn't give a specific power, it gives a direction of how to use power.
Okay, and so you agree with me then that if we're going to build post roads, if we're going to build post offices, if we're going to construct an army or a navy, we're going to deal with counterfeiting laws, we're going to do any of those things, that they have to be implemented across the board, and that special interest groups cannot be identified and catered to through our Constitution. In fact, if the General Welfare Clause is what you agree that it is.
Those statements, articles, clauses 2 through 18 in this passage, are ways of providing for the general welfare.
So you agree that it doesn't provide additional powers?
I'm not.
You agree that the General Welfare Clause does not provide additional powers, it provides direction?
It provides direction.
Very good.
Okay. Then we have the affirmative rebuttal. 5 minutes. Mr. Weiss.
I'm going to ask you guys to think of what you want out of your government. The people who made this Constitution were not meant to be separate elitists that were away from the general public. They were the brightest and best that we had at the time. 55 guys from around the colonies. Sorry, no women, no Indians, no black people. But they were trying to create something that would last, I like to think, forever. They were trying to create something that would continue to improve. As I said earlier, I'm of the position that this is a living, breathing document, and it is our legacy as people living 40 years after the writing of the Constitution. It's our legacy to try to continue to improve our society. We got on the boat at this point in the ride, and our job is to continue to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare. These are the directions that our country is supposed to take in general. It's what I hope you do when you go out and talk to your neighbors and your kids and do your work, as you're trying to do the best you can for your country and make sure that that's part of your decision instead of just selfishness. I don't think that anybody in this room who would come to this thing is particularly selfish. But I do hope that you'll see that if we make a government that's about limiting what we can do for ourselves, we fall into the trap that Mr. Krauser is talking about when it comes to special interests. If we're not looking out for the general welfare, all the people, even the ones we don't like, then we're going to be dominated by our special interests. And that's why I don't want a limit to the General Welfare Clause. I think that America is supposed to be improving the lives of all of our citizens. That's my...
Okay, thank you. Negative rebuttal, 4 minutes, Mr. Krauser.
It was James Madison who said this, and I apologize if I continue at the, I think Mr. Weisser despises it a bit that I continue to refer to the Founding Fathers, but this is the way it's going to be. With respect to the two words, this is James Madison, with respect to the two words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of the powers connected with them. To take them in a literal and unlimited sense would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its creators. He's advocating a view that stands in contradistinction to the Founding Fathers, to the individuals who wrote the document. If he doesn't like it, perhaps Mr. Weisser can rally the troops and we can amend the Constitution. But until that time, the General Welfare Clause was designed to limit, ultimately, what government is permitted to do. And in fact, he outlined that there are 18 clauses. There are actually only 17 clauses that outline their power. The 18th clause simply outlines further how it is that they're going to execute those various powers. I want to make some things clear here. Education. If government, federal government doesn't provide for education, are they not advancing the general welfare? If they don't provide for food stamps at the federal level, are they not providing for the general welfare? If they don't provide for health care, are they not providing for the general welfare? Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a country that was founded upon the idea of federalism, that there are only specified duties that the federal government was to take upon itself. And the remainder of those duties that are not outlined in Article 1, Section 8, for example, or in Article 2 with the executive, or Article 3 with the judicial, were to remain with the states, thus the 10th Amendment. Those powers not given to the federal government remain with the states and with the people. There's nothing, for example, in the Constitution about education, and for good reason. Our founders recognized that education was better entertained at the state level. There's nothing about food stamps. There's nothing about health care in the Constitution itself. Why? Because those issues were better addressed at the state level, at the local level. Consider this. In 1794, James Madison rejected a $15,000 congressional appropriation to assist French refugees. Why? Because there was no provision or authority in the Constitution. In 1796, William Giles rejected a congressional appropriation for a fire that occurred in Savannah, Georgia. Why? Because there was no authority to do so, not even the General Welfare Clause. In 1827, Davy Crockett rejected a congressional appropriation to assist the widow of a naval officer. Why? Because there is no enumerated authority to do so, not even the General Welfare Clause. In 1854, Franklin Pierce, President Pierce, rejected a congressional appropriation for the mentally ill. Why? Because there was no authority to do so. It was a limited document. And then, of course, in February of 1887, it was President Grover Cleveland, also known as Dr. No, who rejected a congressional appropriation to help, assist, and aid drought-stricken farmers. Why? Because there was no authority to do so. It's not just what the founders said anymore. For the first 150 years in this country, we respected the General Welfare Clause, and now we've absolutely mutilated it. We've castrated it. We've made it something that it was never designed to be. And as a result, you know what's happening? We are less free in this country. We are less free. The states have had their power stolen from them. We are less free, ladies and gentlemen. I'm interested in fighting for the original intent, and the General Welfare Clause is something that can get us back on track. Thank you.